Welcome, and thank you for joining us on Get the Tea with Buta. I'm Buta Biberaj, and I'm your host. Today with us, we have our co-host, Krysta Jones. We also have Nick Gothard, who is our tech guru and production director. This morning, we're blessed to have Emily Solari with us. The topic that we're going to talk about today is going to be reading. It's also going to be addressing the equities in reading and being able to discuss how COVID has impacted individuals' ability to be able to stay on track with what they're reading, as well as being able to catch up or hopefully not fall behind, as it may be the case for many of our residents. And welcome, Emily. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. So, we usually are very polite and kind of easy to conversations, but that's not accurate. We will just jump and dive into the questions we want to ask. So, put your seatbelt on. We're gonna pepper you with some questions, but we hope you also will ask us some questions if you have any. So, Emily, give us a little bit about your background, education, and training that leads you to this space for you to be able to speak on.
Sure. So I'm a professor of reading education at University of Virginia. And so what that means is I sort of wear a couple of different hats. One is my internal role at UVA, and then I have an external role at UVA. Internally, what I do is I oversee our reading education program. So how we train teachers to teach reading, and also our reading specialist program. And then externally, I work with a lot of educational stakeholders around reading, like the Virginia Department of Education, parent groups, and different folks who are doing work in reading. And then I have a research agenda. So part of my life is that I work in schools. I have federal grants through the U.S. Department of Education, where we are working in schools to implement evidence-based practices in reading. And my background is that I got my PhD in special education, disability, and risk studies with a focus on human development and reading. And my early work was really looking at how kids in the K-3 space, so kindergarten to third grade, how their reading developed over time, and also how we can work with them to implement evidence-based practices to enhance the development of reading for kids who were struggling to learn how to read.
Well, good. So you're new to this.
Exactly.
Exactly. Well, thank you. For starters, you have kids of your own, do you not?
I do. I have 3 elementary aged boys.
All right. So I'm going to play the boy card. With boys, a lot of people indicate that sometimes it's harder to get them to stay on task, especially if it's an activity that is not physically active and reading is not. How are you handling that from a parent perspective?
Yeah, I think, that it's so different. I have 3 boys and they're all so different. So actually my oldest boy, who's a 5th grader, he really struggled to learn how to read. And I recognized this very early because this is what my life is dedicated to, young children who struggle to learn how to read. And so for him, it's not a preferred task, and it probably will never be a preferred task for him because it's something that's difficult for him. So we can get him to read books now, but he went through, I did a back of the envelope sort of calculation of how many hours of extra instruction he got actually through my clinic when I lived in California. I've only been in Virginia for 3 years now, but I ran a clinic out of California, and he got something like 10,000 extra minutes of reading instruction to get him up basically at grade level. So engaging him in reading is a bit more difficult. My second child came out and he likes to read, and he is a good reader. He is a 3rd grader. And then my 1st grader, he's a very young 1st grader. He's an August baby. So he's one of the youngest kids in his class. And he has struggled because my kids have been out of school since last March. They're not physically in school, they're in virtual school. And I have been sort of watching how they're doing reading instruction on Zoom. And that's been an interesting thing to watch. But then back in June, I decided that the one thing I have to add in this, or to maybe give during this time of COVID, is that I can teach all the neighborhood kids how to learn how to read. So basically, I started pulling the kids in my neighborhood to my front porch, the K to 3 kids who we're going to sort of miss this really critical time for reading instruction. And I have been doing reading instruction on my front porch with all of them. So he's been included in that group, and he's learned how to read that way.
First of all, you're a badass. That is such an awesome opportunity that you identified to be able to give to them, and then to do it, and then to do it so organically for them. I don't know who these kids are, but I want to say thank you, as if they were my own, because they are part of our community. But thank you for doing that.
Right.
The toughest time is when somebody sees a need and they don't know how to address it. It's nice that you put yourself out there and using your expertise to be able to do that.
Yeah, what's interesting about it is that, so much of my work is up here and not sort of directly with kids anymore. And it's been really fun for me, because it turns out that if you use evidence-based approaches to teach kids how to read, they learn how to read. And it's actually really fun to watch them learn how to read.
Right.
So it's been fun for me.
It'd be interesting to know from their perspective, because you're not their teacher. So it's not such this formal, maybe daunting process that, I'm assuming they come willingly. They're not getting dragged across the street by their parents, but they're coming willingly. How do you, for them, pick the types of books or activities so that you keep them engaged?
Well, reading instruction can actually be really fun. And this is when I work with teachers, this is what we talk about. Reading instruction should be fast-paced. It should be game-like. It should be developmentally appropriate. And so we really turn all the games that we're sort of playing with, we're working on language development and being able to understand letters and what they mean and their sounds. All of that is turned into a game, really. And we sort of, for the first 20 to 30 minutes, we're really engaged in that direct instruction of, this is a letter, this is its sound, these are the words that you can write with it, these are different sounds and words, sort of the stuff that we know is an evidence-based way to teach early reading. And then at the end, I always do a read aloud with them. And they get to pick the book. I bring 3 or 4 books, and we, so it's sort of like their prize at the end, like, do this hard work with me. Well, I'm asking you a lot. You're learning new things every day. And at the end, we do a fun read aloud together where we're sort of working on vocabulary and comprehension activities and stuff like that. And they like it.
That's very
Although
cool.
I will say my child is sometimes the hardest one to get there.
And Emily, for those students who are struggling with reading, and I'm asking this, I guess, for the parents who are at home, trying to make sure their kids learn virtually, are there any specific strategies to use for those that are just really struggling with reading?
Right, I think having conversations with kids about letters, letter names, letter sounds, we have to explicitly teach kids this stuff. They don't come out knowing this. They don't arrive, typically, a lot of kids don't arrive at kindergarten knowing this. So, and then playing with the sounds in words. So if I say to you, the word cat, how many sounds are in the word cat? And if they can identify the 3 sounds and sound it out for you, and playing with words in that way is a way to sort of get kids to develop some of these pre and early literacy skills we want them to know. And it does translate into reading.
I love that you say that, because one of my fondest memories from kindergarten, and I don't think they still do these, I'll try to look it up online. We had like letter people, which were like inflatable letters. And so it was like Mr. N with the munchy mouth. And then we made like donuts for D. And like, I clearly remember that. So right. I'm really glad that you said that.
I did letter people too. So they're still alive and kicking.
And then we had the marriage of Q and U, and it was in the paper, and that was really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have those in New York. We had Sesame Street and Alexa Company, and I remember that's where a lot of parents relied on before kids went to kindergarten, for them to be able to get a base foundation. So that's pretty interesting. You were talking about evidence-based teaching. Mm-hmm. How are you engaged now in that process, so that you're taking the knowledge that you have and that you're sharing it with other teachers, so that there's some standards and uniformity as to how they are delivering it?
Wow, that's a really big question. So part of my job at the University of Virginia is so I coordinate our reading education program. And so what that means is we have, of course, we prepare teachers to teach children. And we also have a reading specialist program where we prepare reading specialists to work with children who may be struggling to learn how to read or having difficulties. And the way that we do this is we take what we know as the science of reading. So the science of reading is sort of what we know happens in the brain when kids are learning how to read. There's thousands of studies that have looked at this. And sort of my role is what you just said, sort of that translational piece. So how do we take the basic science of the brain and how kids learn how to read and translate that into evidence-based practice? And then how do we train teachers to learn those evidence-based practices and implement them in their classrooms? So we do this through teacher training, through our education or credential programs, where we've sort of redone and reworked all of our reading methods courses for our teacher trainers, for our students who are coming in who want to be teachers and elementary school teachers and special education teachers, so that what they're learning when they leave UVA, they have a solid evidence base in the science of reading and how that translates to practice. So that's one side of how I do that. And the other side is in my research. So I have a few different federal grants where we're working directly with in-service teachers. So these teachers have been in service teaching kids for maybe 2 years, maybe 25 years. We get all the different types of teachers. And we're going into classrooms and we are developing teacher knowledge around the science of reading and what evidence-based practices are, and coaching them through sometimes fundamentally changing the way in which they're teaching reading in the classroom.
So that you were talking about the fact that you are currently at UVA, and that you've only been in Virginia for about 3 years.
Right.
So can you give us, just by way of background information, how did you get here? Not necessarily in Virginia, but both in Virginia and at UVA, and then you're teaching in this really deep topic area that is very basically fundamental to our kids' development.
Well, how did I get here? That's good. Sometimes I ask myself that question. So I came from California. I worked at University of Texas Health Science Center, Houston, and I was in a developmental pediatrics position there. And then we did a lot of work around early childhood development and reading. And then I am from California, and when the opportunity came up for me to go to California, I moved there and worked in that space around reading also. I worked at University of California, Davis, and their School of Education. And my research has always been about working with teachers in applied settings to help them improve their practice. And I never thought I would leave California, I'll be honest. I never thought I would leave again. And then this opportunity came up. And I decided it was time for a change, and I came to UVA, and we've been really engaged in what has been, there's been difficult work to be done. We've really sort of dug in and have taken the time to sort of self-reflect on our own practice and how we can improve practice so that we are serving teachers and kids in the way that they ought to be served. That's sort of my motto, is that we're not going to apologize for changing practice that makes it so that we are serving teachers and kids in the way that they ought to be.
Now you've I don't want to use the word focus because it may not be accurate, so clarify it for me if it isn't, but you've dedicated some of your teachings in the specialty areas of what we call assistive learning. So if you've got somebody who's got some reading challenges, you've developed some avenues in that arena for teachers to be able to follow. Can you share some of those with us?
Sure. So my take on this has always been that classroom teachers can provide evidence-based practice in reading. So they can absolutely, we can provide them with professional development and coaching to do this. Often the models that we see in schools are that for kids who are struggling to learn how to read or have difficulties learning how to read, sometimes what happens is they get special intervention services from reading specialists or special education teachers or from other people in the school. And that is absolutely important and essential. But also there has to be evidence-based core instruction. So classroom teachers, kindergarten, first, second, and third grade teachers can learn how to implement evidence-based practices, and they can do that for their entire classroom. And what we call this is sort of a preventative model of reading difficulty or reading disability. If we can provide evidence-based practice to the masses, then there'll be fewer kids who need targeted intervention services from reading specialists and special education teachers. So my work has really been thinking about what is feasible for classroom teachers to implement, because they are very busy. They are often overtaxed already. And how can we go into their classroom and really work with them side by side and take feedback from them? Because if I create the most beautiful intervention or curriculum that they can't implement, then it's worthless. So how can we work collaboratively with them to implement these practices and to empower them to see themselves as, quote unquote, interventionists for kids who are struggling to learn how to read?
How do you've put that in the classroom? Is there anything that parents can do to supplement that at home, so that it obviously can't be evidence-based to the level that you're teaching your teachers, but is there, tools that they could add to their toolkit to be able to say, you know what, I can do this and implement it in my home, and it's not overwhelming to the parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen good examples of that, especially we've been forced to sort of move into this space in the last year. But yeah, there are certainly things that parents can do at home. Reading with your child is important, but it's really important to read with your child. But it's not the only thing also, because kids who are struggling to learn how to decode or read words on a page, just reading with them is not going to help them learn how to read, right? For a lot of kids. So playing, what I mentioned before, sort of playing games with the words, pointing out that words have meaning, and that, they're, for some of our younger kids, just sort of point out there's directionality, that we read from left to right, that letters have a sound, and that they make up words. So those are some of the really early literacy things that you can do with kids at home.
Now, I know there's a lot of parents who are very frustrated by having now to assume a little bit more of that responsibility at home, because they had, and I will use the word luxury, they had the luxury of being able to refer and defer to the teachers to do that. And with virtual learning, I think the transition for a lot of our kids has been very difficult. So if somebody was wanting to be able to get a how do I teach, or how do I help my kids do better with the reading, is there a resource that can guide them on a kind of like a menu or an instructional guide?
Yeah, so some of my colleagues at the Florida Center for Reading Research have put out a lot of instructional videos and also activities for parents to do with their kids at home. And I don't know if there's somewhere where you all post resources, but I'm happy to get that to you. And I think that, yeah, I think it's a really valuable resource for parents. And there's other organizations that have done this during the time of COVID, so I'm happy to get that to you. And they're like fun activities. They take 10 to 20 minutes. And they're game-like activities with kids that develop literacy skills.
Oh, that'd be wonderful, because I know I've got family and friends who are dealing with that. And some of the challenges that they have as parents is feeling that they put extra pressure on their kids. Mm-hmm. They don't feel comfortable doing it. They feel the pressure. And then your word fun does not enter into their actions at all. Just because everybody's stressing over what's going on, that they just really don't have a good handle on how to do it in a safe space, so that nobody's feeling judged. So that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, I mean, as a parent right now, I also would say give yourself some grace. It's hard. And I remember UVA asked me when we all first went into lockdown, they asked, or lockdown or quarantine, what can we put out there for parents? And I wrote, there's actually something on the website. There's a question and answer with me or something. And I was just like, kids who struggle or struggling to know how to read, like I said, this is not a preferred activity for them. And so that becomes a really stressful situation in a home, especially when everyone is already stressed out. So don't forget, I mean, it's a hard thing.
It is. Well, thank you for expanding on that they are resources, and we would love to be able to add them to our site so that people can access it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me switch gears a little bit, because you also do a fair amount of work as an instructor, teaching people how to advance or enhance how they teach English as a second language.
Mm-hmm.
How
Yes.
did you get into that aspect of it? And then what is the strength of the programs that you are promoting?
So how did I get into? So I actually lived as an adolescent in Spain for 3 years. So I learned Spanish. And I actually I was in a classroom for about 7 months where I had no idea what was going on. Everyone was speaking Spanish and I had no clue what was going on. And then I came back to California, and I went through the University of California, the system. And I realized that I was really interested in how literacy developed in kids who were Spanish speaking, and what that means for sort of their access to the curriculum, and also what it means when you come into a classroom with a language that's different than the language of the classroom, and how you can utilize your first language to build your skills in English. So that was sort of a research interest of mine. And actually my dissertation study was on this. And so I was very interested in how reading develops in these groups of kids. And I ran an intervention study for my dissertation where we looked at developing early literacy, phonological awareness, and listening comprehension in kids who are Spanish speaking. And so, I think what's important to know is that kids who speak Spanish or any other alphabetic language, when they're learning how to read in English, they're going through the same processes, right? They might be a little bit different and they have a whole other language that, they have access to. But when they're learning to read in English, their brain processes are similar. And so what we're doing is we're trying to use the strengths in their native language and we also know that their language strengths and their reading strengths in native language that crosses over to English. So there is some research on that. So we're trying to use that to develop their skills in English. And the processes are very, very similar. Kids who speak Spanish as their first language and come into kindergarten speaking Spanish and having some English. Some of the things that we do are very similar, but also we want to make sure that we're developing their oral language skills in English, for example, because we know that when kids learn how to read, that reading comprehension is really the goal, right? Like we want kids to understand what they're reading. And to be able to do that, they have to have two broad skills. They have to be able to they have to be able to read the words, right? Just really read the words on the page, but then they also have to understand the language. So they have to have the vocabulary and the content area knowledge to understand what's going on. And so we want to develop both of those skills at the same time, from pre-K on through 12th grade.
Okay, so when my family came from Europe, from Montenegro, and I was 2.5, so I in the house, my parents insisted that we speak Albanian.
Okay.
Obviously, in the community, we spoke English. So you had
Right.
that dual challenge there. And I remember even now to this day, when I think about it, sometimes my brain thinks in Albanian in some matters, and then obviously in English, but they're not uniform. They don't conjugate the same types of verbs, and you just don't have that consistency to say that one is exactly a replication of the other. The next generation of my family wanted to have nothing to do with learning Albanian because they were, the kids wanted to learn English. Those nephews and nieces now have kids, and they are being very precise and insistent in trying to make sure they have a second language in the home.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting how that progression is done. And I think it's because studies also talk about multiple languages, I think, use greater portions of the brain or different sides of the brain so that it actually is a benefit. It's not a detriment. Can you shed some from a study perspective rather than anecdotal, whether there is something to support that?
Right. So it's actually quite a controversy in the research literature. So we talk about this as the bilingual advantage. And there is, I think it's still an empirical question. So, and I know people hate when I say that because You
not
want to know
an
the
answer.
Yeah, this is a very researcher answer for you. It's an empirical question. So there have been several studies that point to that there is an advantage, sort of a cognitive processing advantage to knowing two different languages. But then there's some that point to the fact that there's not. And so I think it's still an unanswered question. But, I think when I think about young children in school settings, my experience is mainly with communities that speak Spanish. I think part of this is that we want young children and their families to feel comfortable in the school space. And sometimes that means that it is important for them to maintain, literacy and language in their first language. And so we want to be welcoming of that. We want to not discourage that parents speak with their children in the language that they've spoken with them in since they were born. So I think, just from a welcoming perspective and sort of making sure that folks feel safe in a space, we want to encourage children if their family chooses for them to be bilingual. I've chosen for my family, my children go to a dual language school in Albemarle County. So that's what we chose for my family, because there are people in my life, folks that live in Spain, that only speak Spanish. And I want my kids to be able to communicate with them.
That's very cool. So now there's actually a series of smaller schools out here that we see in Northern Virginia, in Falls Church, and I'll call them immersion schools. They're not called that, but that is actually what they do at a very young age, and they'll take them as early as toddlers, and they'll put them in a language program. So all day long they are exposed to that particular language. Obviously, when they go home, then they get the English as well. But in the schools, in those classrooms, it is an immersion program. Mm-hmm. When you were in Spain, did they have English as a second language for you, or were you immersed and it was really, here you are, and we'll wait for you while you learn it?
So I was in high school, and no, there was nothing for me.
Okay.
No, there was nothing for me, and that's fine. That was sort of the way it was okay. I actually ended up doing high school and then some college there. But it would, the first few months, it was exhausting because you're trying to figure out what all the stuff that's happening around you. So
very cool. Now, what we also have when we're talking about the challenges, I'm switching away from the dual languages. Mm-hmm. We have kids who are challenged with having dyslexia or other, and do we call them learning disabilities still?
We do.
Because I want to really call them learning inabilities or something less ability. That disability is, we've worked away from that in the physical sense, but we still kind of keep that label, which makes kids not want to participate in that class. Are we doing anything from the educational system to suggest that we want to change that narrative as to the labeling?
Well, the labeling comes down from a federal law around special mm-hmm. education. And I think every state has a different, not every state, but a lot of states have different ways that they do this. For example, Texas has, they label kids as dyslexic, whereas some in California does not. It's a phonological processing deficit. So this is really left up to a state sort of decide how to implement this. We do kids with dyslexia. We certainly call it dyslexia, and then the other thing that we also call is specific learning disability. Because there are different types of learning disabilities, because there's math disability, there's reading disability, there's writing. So so we do still use the term.
So within the classrooms, what can the schools do to maybe soften the labeling of that so that other kids don't look at it as it's something like you're less than because you have to go with that teacher or you're in that classroom? What can our schools do to soften that a bit?
Well, I think that we need to approach reading, I'm going to talk a little bit about a global approach to reading as a preventative model. Like our instruction in kindergarten, first and second grade and third grade, it has to be evidence-based. It needs to be aligned with the science of reading as a way to prevent reading difficulties. Because it's not just kids with dyslexia who struggle with the reading development. It's not just kids who have, who have reading difficulties. There are large proportions of kids who aren't accessing evidence-based curriculum in schools. If you look at the national level of, the national scores on reading at 12th grade, only 37% of the nation's kids are reading proficiently. And and similar trends in 4th and 8th grade. And if you look at the disparity sort of between our Black children, our English learners, and white children, there are very large gaps. And so I think that we really need to think about this a bit more globally, and also think about it in intensity and dosage. And what I mean is that if every child walked into a kindergarten classroom in Virginia where their teacher had been trained in evidence-based practice and they had the curriculum and the tools necessary to implement, then there would be fewer kids identified as having reading difficulties, so needing that extra instruction. And that's so. And the reality is we aren't doing that in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd and 3rd grade right now. We have a long way to go.
You were talking about the disparities between races. You talked about disparities as far as access and opportunity. How are we dealing with that, especially right now during COVID? Because I believe it's been accentuated. It's become much more clear how disparate it is. One, how's it being identified? And two, how can we address it as to now know that it exists? How do we help make amends to that?
Yes, this is a really big question. So in Virginia, we do, in most divisions, most school divisions, we use a screening system called PALS for reading. And so we have state level data, and actually I can also, my colleague, Dr. Anita Begenti, is the director of the PALS screening assessment. And we've run some analyses to show that, if you look at this year's kindergarten group compared to last year, and this year's 1st grade group compared to last year, that there are a larger proportion of children who are at risk for reading difficulties as compared, to pre-COVID in both kindergarten and 1st grade. And that that when you look at the subgroups of kids, so English learners, our Black kids, our kids who are in the Hispanic, those proportions are even larger. So it certainly has exacerbated inequities. And I think we all knew that there were inequities in schools before COVID. I think COVID, sort of the stuff that's sort of been bubbling below the surface has sort of come out and is now there for everyone to see. It's, you can't ignore it. And, I think with that comes opportunity. If there are data showing that the situation is even worse than it was 2 years ago, then we really need to respond. There needs to be a coordinated effort. We need to an educational recovery plan that is specifically targeted to groups of children who have historically been marginalized in schools. Reading is a foundational skill. Kids need to learn how to read to be able to access almost every single content area in school. You think about science and social studies and even math. There's a component of reading in every single one of those. So of course, my bias is that reading is the most important thing in the world. But I do think that we need to have a coordinated, targeted plan that puts resources where they need to be with the kids who are having the most difficulties, so to sort of recover.
I actually am going to agree with you 100% that reading is the most fundamental as well as the most important one, because it does traverse everything that everybody does. It could be obviously in the school system, in the employment business, anything that anybody has, it requires some sort of reliance on reading. So I think you get my vote on that aspect of it. So when we're dealing with these inequities, and in Loudoun County, what we've done recently is in the Loudoun chapter of the NAACP, made a formal complaint to our Attorney General's office regarding the inequities in their education here in Loudoun. So I will put this out there. Loudoun, we're very fortunate in Loudoun County. We have significant means. We have, a very big heart. We really all try to do right. But sometimes the problem is we just don't get it 100% right. And then there's that argument between, is it ability or is it opportunity?
Right.
I tend to sway into thinking it's the opportunity. What has your study, your experience been able to establish? And then to go back to your premise as far as we need to have this task force, or not task force, I'm sorry. We need to have an approach on this to be able to figure out is how do we bring it up to some par so that we have that equity?
Right. So sort of you're talking about between ability and opportunity is in the education world, we often talk about achievement gaps, but then we talk about opportunity gaps. And I think reading is a systemic issue. Like this is an opportunity gap. And this is no fault of teachers. I want to be very, very clear about that. That, teachers operate in a very broad educational system. And if a teacher is going, for example, if they go to a school to get their teaching credential where they're not taught how to teach reading in an evidence-based way, that's not their fault. And if they land in a school that doesn't have evidence-based curriculum or professional development to further their knowledge, that's also not their fault. So they're operating in this very broad system. So I think that we need to think critically about, where are our kids that are marginalized? Where are they going to school? How are we responding to their needs? How are we developing teacher knowledge to be able to respond to their needs? What are the policies put in place for children who are struggling to learn how to read? There's a lot of sort of unanswered questions. When I talk about this, I often talk about it in like, there are multiple levers that we have to be pushing on simultaneously. There's no silver bullet here. And we have to be pushing on all of them at the same time if we really want reading to change or reading outcomes to change.
I think that's something that we identified due to COVID and all of this distance learning, is that we really treat, as a community, we treat schools as a silo. Like, I've given you my kid, here you are, and make them the best educated, most able that you can. This has exposed the fact that it is a community issue. Parents have to be invested, and invested doesn't mean that they weren't invested. It just means that they have to be an active participant. People such as yourself who, take you out of your formal role as a neighbor. You were invested in your neighborhood kids to say, what, I'm going to get together a handful of them. I can't do 40, but I could do 3 or 4. Being able to look at that from a much more global and community perspective to say that we are all invested in being able to make sure that they are reaching their ability to be able to develop and learn as much as they can.
Right.
You've traveled internationally. You're now, you came from the West Coast. I've never lived in the West Coast. I'm an East Coast person, so I don't think that was a big loss or a big challenge for you, but it might have been to have to come back to the East Coast. But we welcome the fact that you are here. In your experiences, is there anyone that's doing it? Like, is there a model that we can literally cut and paste and steal as a community? I'd be as familiar with, but to say, here's a great role model for us to be able to work as a collaborative system, that we're bringing in all of those previous silos together to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the kids. And we're creating the opportunities for the teachers. We're creating an opportunity for employers to have well-versed individuals, just so that we all get that huge success that we're looking for.
Right. There are a few communities that I think you can look for. So there's some communities that have sort of been through this aha moment of readings. Everyone knows reading is really important, but to know it's really important and actually say, and we're going to do something about it, are two different things. Right. So there's a few, a few districts that have gone through this in Pennsylvania, and they may have been at it a bit longer than we have in Virginia. That have, leadership. And I think part of it, the really important piece here is leadership that's on the same page. So you mentioned we are a community and everyone I always say we're a community and everyone has a role. Everybody has a role in making sure that kids can learn how to read. And so that's the school board, that's the school administrator, that's the teacher, it's the parents, it's everybody. And so I think one of the is that folks have to come together, and these are really not easy conversations to have. They're very difficult conversations to have because there are really true philosophical differences in the educational community about how we should be teaching kids how to read. And so you have to be willing to engage in difficult conversations. I think 50% of my job right now is engaging in difficult conversations.
Wow.
Because you just had to be willing to come to the table, and you have to have the right people at the table. But everybody wants to get reading right. That's the other part that's fascinating to me when I have these conversations. Nobody wants to get this wrong. We all want kids to learn how to read. And so if we keep that in mind, if that's the goal, you may have to go through 50 difficult conversations, but at least you're sort of moving the line. You're moving the needle. You're sort of getting there. I think we had to sort of engage as a community around it. But there are some examples. There's a few examples of different superintendents in districts that have taken this on, and they're moving the needle, and you can see it through their data. They're kids who we typically, sort of our marginalized groups of kids, they are making progress.
So where are these people?
There's a few. I can give you, if you want, for the resources for people. There's a few different. They've been interviewed in different sort of news places, Ed Week, and one is in the Allentown, Bethlehem area in Pennsylvania. He's doing a lot of work there. There's a group that I have engaged with in Missouri that is doing some interesting work. And in fact, we've had, I don't know if you know, we've had 2 different literacy summits that have been sponsored by the Virginia Department of Education. And we had the superintendent and a principal from the site in Missouri come and talk to all of the superintendents in Virginia. And that's actually available. That panel conversation is available on YouTube, so people can watch that.
Excellent, because this is what we want to do with our conversations here. Yeah. It's not to suggest that somebody's doing something wrong, because you're right. Everybody's limited by time, means, ability, knowledge. I mean, but I don't know anybody, especially dealing with kids, that goes into that profession to say, how can I mess a kid up?
Right.
We don't do that, right? Everybody is trying to do the best that they can.
Mm-hmm.
That being the case, is just sometimes identifying it, because the muscle memory is huge. We've done it always this way is fine, but it's not fine, right? We're constantly learning, and you're talking about evidence-based teaching. I am a lawyer, so everything we're trying to do now within the law is also trying to do to make it evidence-based, because data tells us. We all can have an anecdotal story about this is when it worked and this is when it didn't work. Right. And that's fine, it's somewhat educational, but when you sit down and you look at data, then you're like the aha moment, which is maybe we can do it differently, maybe we can do it better, or maybe we highlight the fact that this portion of it is working great, let's
Right.
keep replicating it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we don't have to throw anything out, we just have to figure out to identify how it's working. In Loudoun County, as I said earlier, we spend upwards of, nowadays it's a little bit less because our money base is growing in taxes, but I remember a time when I first started living here, we were between the high 60s and 70% of our tax base was going to the school board, to the school, public school system.
Mm-hmm.
We're not cheap. We're not trying to, shorten anybody's expenses as far as being able to do that. So we want to invest wisely in it. But these are things that I would love to be able to figure out, is how do we come to the table to say, we're putting the money in, we're investing, how do we get a better return on our investment? And the reading part is huge for us, because that is the basic foundation to everything where the kid goes. However they advance in their classes, it's got to be based by them being have the foundation of a good reading base. So we want to be able to do that. So nothing that we're talking about here is a slight to the teachers, to the school board, or to the principals. We're not suggesting that at all, but just saying, hey, this is an identified limitation. How do we expand on it?
Right.
So I appreciate you having a shout out for the teachers earlier, because that's great to make sure that we're messaging it appropriately. We are not calling out teachers that they're not doing their jobs. That's a tough position.
Right.
I taught for 3 years, so I remember how awesome it was because the kids worship the heck out of you. But it's also a very tough challenge because you are forming these kids and trying to figure out, oh my gosh, how do I not mess it up?
Right.
So it's a huge challenge for them as well. So now what I want to be able to do is, as we're talking about these different avenues, you indicated that there was the education summit you call it literacy summit that Department of Ed had. Was that an invitation to all of the school systems, or was that selective based on their ability to be able to meet the attendance limitations?
So both of them were open to all school systems, all divisions. The first one we had in Charlottesville right before COVID hit. So we had it in February of 2020, end of February. And then we had a second one, I think October of 2020, and that one was virtual. So that one has been recorded and it is available online. And
so I'm going to joke a little bit. Can I see the attendance log see if anybody from Loudon came?
I'm sure someone from Loudon came.
I'm just joking. I would not expect less.
Yeah.
So when you guys did those summits, was there a specific focal point that you were trying to communicate to the attendees?
Right. So the first one was really about the science of reading. What is the science of reading, and how do we think about this as practice in schools, applied in applied settings? The second one had more of a focus on early literacy, and so we talked a bit more about I talked about the science of reading again, but also sort of how do we contextualize this in sort of a preventative model for kids for pre-K to about 3rd or 4th grade. Like, how do we really focus on those years so that when kids get into 5th and 6th and 7th and older grades, that they have the reading skills necessary to comprehend what they're reading and engage with more complex texts through textbooks and all that stuff.
You indicated earlier, and I apologize if I get the numbers wrong. Did you say 37% of our high school kids do not read at high school level?
So if you look at the national scores through the NAEP, which that's NAEP, scores 37 only 37% of high schoolers are reading at a proficient level.
Wow.
And I can get you the links for that as well if you want. So those data just came out very recently, and then at the very end of 2019 and maybe early 2020, the 4th and 8th grade scores. So they assess kids in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade, and the 4th and 8th grade ones were very similar. And actually, what happened in 2019 that sort of it was sort of a red flag for folks across the country is that for the first time in a long time, the NAEP reading scores went down. And, they had sort of been just maintaining, not getting any better, but just maintaining over the last 20 years, but they actually went down in 2019. And that I think was, and they went down in Virginia. And that has not, and so I think that, I know that, that our state superintendent, James Lane, took that seriously. And that's why we have had these series of literacy summits and sort of this push toward, okay, now what are we doing? And then COVID hit, which of course, threw another wrench in this, because that has impacts, that's going to have impacts probably for years on young children and their reading development.
Now, you indicated it might have an impact. Like, what are the indicators that we could watch for to see how much of an impact it will have? Because I agree with you. I think it will significantly impact our kids.
Yeah, I think the data is already telling us that it has an impact. And when you look at the proportion of kids who are at risk at kindergarten and 1st grade entry, of course, those data will be continued to be collected. There's national level data that show that especially for kids who have had difficulties in the past, so kids with disabilities, our English language learners, our kids from high poverty, that they are actually their reading scores are going down at a higher rate than kids who aren't in that situation. So actually the gap, there's some indication that the gaps may be getting wider, which is alarming. And so when I talk about what is, we need a plan. We need a state level plan. What is our educational recovery plan? And that's targeted to the kids who really need extra help.
I don't know if you depressed the heck out of me or you gave me a lot more hope.
Well, I'll tell you,
guys.
This is the stuff that keeps me up at night. I'll be like, this is what I've dedicated my life to. And, I think reading and literacy is an equity issue. It has longitudinal impact on, high school graduation, on, income, on, incarcerated youth. There's just so many, there's a lot of things that are correlated with reading. And I think sometimes we forget this, but like this is what's driving me is how do we do this, and how do we do it in a way that is feasible for teachers? Teachers are a powerful tool, and they are and they need to be treated like professionals. So how do we engage and collaborate with teachers in a way that's professional, but also sort of helps them in their own practice?
I think to take that and expand it also from the school system, how do you give them the resources to be able to do their job at the level that they want to do it, which is better? Because as I said, I don't see anybody going into teaching to see how could I not do it well. And you don't want to beat them down with not having resources, and they're always struggling, trying to stay on top of it. And they just constantly, feel like they're somewhat diminished by the community.
Right.
Because
especially right now.
And you have that challenge to, you're not a good teacher because you don't want to be back in the school system. And, teachers are being made to feel fungible. Like there's nobody care about me if I go back to schools because I've got a family, I've got my own health, I've got my own concerns. How do we balance that? And then unfortunately, that's the COVID effect. But from a broader perspective, how do we figure out, like, how does the school system take the data that you have? Mm-hmm. And they look at it and say, we are at the high school level. Obviously, we could add resources at the high school level, but it's almost like a plant. At the root, how do we treat the roots very well so that they are then embedded, and as the plant or the child grows, then they've grown stronger with those a strong skill set that they could keep flourishing from.
Right.
So kind of how do they take the data from the higher levels that they're testing at 4, 8 in high school and being able to bring it and drawing it down to reflect on the kindergarten or pre-kindergarten levels?
Yeah, I think, I always go back to this preventative model because it's so important. When we think about this, like, we do not want children to fail. We want to prevent them from failing. So we have to be implementing the correct strategies in K, first, second, and third grade. And that's sort of really, if you're thinking about where do we start. The other thing that's, I think, really important from a resource perspective for districts and divisions is that, first of all, we know that kids who are struggling to learn how to read, they don't just outgrow this. Kids don't outgrow struggling to learn how to read. They need explicit instruction, right? And we actually know a lot about how to do that instruction right. We also know that if they're not caught early, so like K, first grade, second grade, third grade, that by the time kids are in fourth grade, it takes 4 times the amount of time to remediate a reading difficulty. So if you really think about that from a resource level, like if I'm talking to a superintendent, we're like, why would you wait until 4th grade? Your resources will be overtapped, but we can do this preventatively in K to 3. And we also know from the data and from research that there are ways to screen for kids that have reading difficulties. So we can actually give sort of short assessments to kids in kindergarten and first grade, and we can, with pretty good accuracy, figure out which ones are going to be struggling. And so you take those data and you respond to the data by designing your instruction to meet the needs of that kid. And so if we really get in this, we really need to make sure that we're using the data that we have at our, sort of at our fingertips to guide targeted instruction for kids who are struggling.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
I do appreciate your time, because I think this is something that as a community, we're always very concerned about the level of education and the quality of education and the success of education that our kids have. And it's just a matter of trying to come together as a community, figuring out how we can do it better. So Nick or Krysta, I don't know if either of you had any questions or any comments. And then Emily, I'm going to ask if you have any closing comments, because I don't want to have not address some of the things that you would love for our community to hear about reading and the good things about it and what we need to do to focus. But I'll see if Nick or Krysta has something.
Somewhat of a selfish question. I'm in the process of writing, having a children's book illustrated, K through 3rd grade, focused on civic education. And I was just curious what you think makes a good children's book.
Ooh, that's a hard one.
Oh, okay.
I could do a whole other hour on that.
Oh, no.
It's interesting that you say that. So I actually had a doctoral student in California, and she's now a professor in California, and she was a children's author as well as my doctoral student. And so she writes books, and I think it's important for kids to be able to see kids that are like them in books. Mm-hmm. And it's actually really rare. Most of the books that we have are about white children or about animals. So I just say that because there's actually more books about animals than there are about diverse children, for example. And I'm talking about diversity from disability to, ability levels, to ethnic diversity, to language. So I think, I just really think it's important that kids are able to sort of see themselves in books. And engaging stories are always fun. But yeah, I've been thinking, I learn a lot from my doctoral students, and my doctoral student, Janae, one of the things that we've been sort of working with. So part of my research is how do you get your kids to learn how to read, but also like in tandem with that, we want them to be immersed in high quality children's literature, because they learn a lot through children's literature. But we also want kids who are, diverse to be able to see themselves in that literature. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just what pops in my head when people ask.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question actually, and I've been thinking about this as we've talked about sort of the science of reading, and like you said, there's no silver bullet that's gonna fix everything and put us on the right track, but we have the benefit, on this show of having a lot of folks tuning in, many of whom are parents or teachers. And if you could recommend just like a little bit, like either like rewriting a misperception or just adding just a little nugget of knowledge to their toolbox about assisting students in reading or understanding something about the science of reading, what do you think is something that's either missed out about or misunderstood that you would give to them?
About the science of reading broadly, is that your question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so the science of reading has been written about a lot recently. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions. So again, I could talk for an hour about that. Importantly, the science of reading is not a checklist. It's not a certain curriculum. It is not just sort of a list of things that you do with kids. It's really, and it's not about only teaching phonics, because often folks say, well, science of reading is just about teaching phonics. And when I say phonics, that's about, you're just worried about that kids can read words. Well, no, I want kids to understand what they're reading, and I want them to immerse themselves in really, difficult texts. I want them to have access to everything. And so I think those are sort of the main misconceptions that folks have about the science of reading. The science of reading, it explains how reading develops in the brain. But my job as a researcher, I'm not a basic scientist. I'm not in a lab sitting around looking at kids' brains. but I use that knowledge to translate that into classroom practice. That's my job, the translation piece. And so I think that the misconception there is that we're just using the brain science and then pushing it straight into schools, and that's why it's not working. But like, really, we need to have these difficult conversations and these complex conversations about what does that translation look like? How is it feasible for teachers? And how can we do it at scale? Right? Because if we're just changing one classroom, one teacher, one school, it's not enough. We need to know how to do this at scale. So I don't know if that answers your question either, but that's sort of what popped in my head.
I think the theme is that we're just going to have you back to talk about so much more. But yes, it was great. Thank you.
And Emily, Nick is 100% correct. This is a conversation that might, if you're interested in doing, require you to come back to expand on that, because it is one, a tough conversation because we don't have the easy solutions. Right. It's a tough conversation because we identify the problems and we know that they exist. Mm-hmm. And then when you have that conflict there, it makes it harder to figure out, okay, that who's going to step up and bring everybody together so that we have a community response to this. Right. So it's definitely, so anything that you want to close with, this is your opportunity now.
No, I just think that you're really right about the community response and everybody having a role. I think we do need to think about this as a broad issue, and that in the responsibility for this cannot fall on the heads of only on teachers. We all have a role in this. And that's from the university level. So my institution has a role. We have to train teachers correctly. The state legislatures have a role in the policies. The administrators making decisions about which curricula to purchase have a role. Everybody does. Parents, we all have the school boards. And so sort of thinking broadly is really important. I'll say it again, we have to push on multiple levers simultaneously, and that will require multiple different, stakeholders.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you for all the information that you provided for us, as well as you taking your time here today to be able to share that with us. You're welcome any point in time that you want to return to Get the Tea with Buta. We would welcome you. We welcome the knowledge that you've laid upon us here today. So we wish you the best for the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our pleasure. Thank you.